Wade Calloway heard the trailer before he saw it, the hollow metallic bang of a hoof against a steel gate, and by the time he'd crossed the yard the driver already had the ramp down and a bull backing out into the morning light that didn't belong on his place at all. Wade stood at the fence rail and looked at the animal for a long moment without saying anything. The paperwork clipped to the driver's board said Calloway Ranch, Route 4, and the tag in the bullseye said something else entirely, a string of numbers that didn't match a single animal Wade had ever ordered. The driver didn't seem to notice anything wrong. He asked Wade to sign, said he had 2 more stops before noon, and was back in the cab before Wade had gotten past the second line of the delivery sheet. If you've ever had something valuable land on your doorstep by mistake, and had to decide in the space of about 10 minutes whether to send it back or keep quiet and see what it was worth, stay with me, because that's exactly the position Wade Calloway found himself in that morning, and what he did next is the reason this story is still being told. It was April of 2015, on a cattle operation outside Cross Timbers, Oklahoma, and Wade Calloway was 34 years old, running 210 acres of mixed pasture and hay ground that his grandfather had started and his father had held onto through years that hadn't always been kind to it. Wade wasn't a big operation by anybody's measure, 60 cow-calf pairs on a good year, a modest set of working pens, and a single stock trailer that had more rust on it than paint. He'd taken the place over from his father 5 years earlier, after a stretch of drought years had thinned the herd down to a number that barely covered the note, and he'd spent those 5 years doing the slow, unglamorous work of building it back, one careful breeding decision at a time, because a small operation like his didn't have room for a wasted season or a bad bull. He'd been expecting a young Angus bull that spring, ordered through Triangle Livestock Company out of the stockyards 2 counties over, a company that handled bull sales and transport for half the ranches in that part of the state. What came off that trailer instead was older, heavier through the shoulder, with a set of horns that told Wade right away this wasn't the yearling he'd paid for. He called Triangle Livestock before the truck had even cleared his gate. The woman who answered put him through to a man named Russ Delacroix, who handled logistics for the company and who listened to Wade's description for about 30 seconds before he said, without much interest, that it sounded like a mix-up on the loading dock, that a bull consigned to a ranch further west had probably gone out on the wrong trailer, and that he'd get somebody out to swap the animals within the week. Wade asked what would happen to the bull in the meantime. Russ Delacroix said not to worry about it, that the animal was headed for a cull sale regardless, some paperwork issue with the consignor that had already knocked him out of the breeding program he was supposed to go into, and that keeping him fed for a few extra days wasn't going to hurt anybody. Wade didn't say much else on the call. He hung up, walked back out to the pen, and did what he'd been doing since he was a kid too small to see over the rail, which was stand quietly at a fence and actually look at an animal instead of just glancing at it. What he saw didn't match what Russ Delacroix had described over the phone. The bull was thick through the loin in a way that took years of correct feeding and better genetics than a cull animal usually carried. His feet were set right, square underneath him, no sign of the kind of structural fault that gets an animal pulled from a program. His coat had the kind of shine that comes from more than pasture grass. And low on his left hip, half hidden under hair, Wade found a small tattooed brand he didn't recognize, 3 letters and a number, the kind of mark a serious breeding operation puts on an animal it's tracking closely, not the kind of mark you'd expect on a bull somebody was trying to quietly get rid of. Now let me ask you something, because it's the question Wade was sitting with that whole afternoon. When a company tells you a valuable thing is actually worthless, and hands you a story that explains why, do you take the story at face value, or do you go find out for yourself whether the story holds up? Wade drove to the county extension office the next morning with a photograph of that hip tattoo in his shirt pocket. The extension agent didn't recognize the brand either, but she knew who might, and gave Wade the number of a man named Otis Renfro, 78 years old, who'd spent 40 years buying and selling registered Angus cattle before he'd mostly retired to a smaller place outside town, and who still knew more bloodlines by memory than most men could find in a stack of papers. Wade drove out that same afternoon. Otis looked at the photograph for a long time without saying much, turned it over like there might be something on the back, and then asked Wade to describe the animal itself, every detail, the horn set, the top line, the way he carried his weight. When Wade finished, Otis set the photograph down on his kitchen table and said that tattoo belonged to a breeding program out of a ranch in the Texas Panhandle that had built a reputation over about 15 years for producing exactly the kind of thick-made, correct-footed bulls Wade had just described. He said if that bull was really out of that line, and if he was really sound, Triangle Livestock had made a considerably bigger mistake than a mixed-up delivery. Wade asked what he thought the animal was actually worth. Otis said that depended entirely on the paperwork, and paperwork was the one thing a hip tattoo couldn't give him. That's the part of this story that took the longest, and it's worth telling slowly, because it's the part where most people would have given up. Wade spent the better part of 3 weeks working the phone and driving to 2 different sale barns, tracking down anyone who might know how a bull out of a respected panhandle program had ended up on a random consignment truck bound for cull. He started at the stockyards where Triangle Livestock ran its regular sales, asking around the loading docks and the coffee counter where order buyers gathered before the morning auction, describing the tattoo and the animal's build to anyone who'd listen. Most people shook their heads. A few remembered seeing a load come through a few weeks earlier that had included an older bull nobody could place, but nobody had thought much of it at the time, because odd animals passed through those pens every week and there wasn't time to ask questions about all of them. What he eventually pieced together, mostly from a livestock order buyer who'd handled part of the original consignment, was that the bull had been pulled from that breeding program over what the seller's paperwork called a fertility concern flag during a routine test, a note that had followed the animal onto Triangle's books and gotten him quietly sorted toward the cull load without anybody actually retesting him first. Wade asked the order buyer directly whether anyone along the chain, the original seller, the transport company, or Triangle itself, had ever run a second test to confirm the flag before shipping the bull off as a loss. The order buyer said that wasn't how it worked. Once a flag like that got attached to an animal's paperwork, it followed him from barn to barn like a debt nobody wanted to be the one to forgive, and it was cheaper and faster for everyone in that chain to just pass the animal along toward slaughter weight than to pay for a fresh test that might or might not change anything. One flagged form, copied forward from company to company, had turned a bull that might be worth real money into an animal nobody wanted to look at twice. Wade drove back out to see Otis Renfro a second time that week, this time with a notebook of his own, and asked the old man plainly what it would take to actually settle the question instead of guessing at it. Otis told him there was only one way to know for certain, and it wasn't a phone call or a photograph or a bloodline chart. It was a real breeding soundness exam, run properly, by somebody with no reason to care which way the answer came out. Wade's neighbor, a man named Kurt Whitfield who ran cattle on the section next door, heard the whole story over the fence one evening and didn't bother hiding what he thought of it. Kurt had been ranching in that county for close to 30 years, longer than Wade had been alive, and he'd seen enough young operators get burned by hoping for the best on an animal with a mark against him. He told Wade that if a bull had a fertility flag on his paperwork, keeping him around and hoping for the best was a good way to lose a breeding season for nothing, and that Wade would be better off sending the animal back to Triangle and letting them sort out their own mess. "You've got 60 pairs and a note to think about," Kurt said. "You can't afford to gamble a whole season on a bull somebody else already gave up on." It wasn't said unkindly. Kurt had been ranching a long time, and a flagged bull was, by every rule he'd ever operated under, a bull you didn't gamble on. Wade heard him out and didn't argue. He also didn't send the bull back. What Wade did instead was call a large animal veterinarian out of the University Extension Service and pay for a full breeding soundness exam out of his own pocket, the kind of test that checks semen quality, motility, and structural soundness directly rather than relying on whatever note happened to be sitting in a file somewhere. The vet ran the test on a Thursday morning in May, and the results came back 2 days later showing a bull that was, in her words, well above satisfactory on every measure the exam covered. Whatever had triggered that original fertility flag, it wasn't reflected in the animal standing in Wade's pen in the spring of 2015. Wade called Triangle Livestock one more time after that, mostly out of fairness, to tell Russ Delacroix what the test had shown and to ask whether the company wanted the bull back now that the paperwork question had an actual answer. Russ Delacroix said the swap had already been processed on their end, the original bull that was meant for Wade had already gone out to another buyer, and as far as Triangle's books were concerned, the cull-bound animal sitting on Wade's place was no longer their problem to manage. He didn't apologize for the flag. He didn't ask any questions about the test results either. He just said Wade was welcome to do whatever he wanted with him. Wade bred him to 18 cows that first season, a conservative number for a bull that size, mostly because Wade still wasn't fully certain what he had. The calves started arriving the following spring, and it didn't take an expert eye to see something different about them. They hit the ground heavier than Wade's other calves without any trouble at calving, grew fast on nothing but pasture and hay, and by the time they were weaned that fall, 3 separate buyers who came through Wade's place for other business stopped at that pen and asked, unprompted, where that bull had come from. Otis Renfro drove out that November to see the calf crop for himself. He walked the pen slowly, the way he'd looked at the photograph months before, and didn't say much until he was most of the way through. Then he told Wade that whatever paperwork had gotten that bull sorted toward a coal truck, somebody along the way had made a mistake that was going to cost them a great deal more than they realized, because a bull that threw calves like that wasn't something you found twice in a career, let alone by accident. Word moved the way it does in ranching country, slowly through sale barns and feed stores and the kind of conversations that happen leaning on a truck bed, and by the spring of 2017 Wade had a waiting list of ranchers wanting breeding access to the bull, more than he could accommodate on his own cow herd. It started with a rancher from 2 counties over named Delbert Okafor, who'd bought 3 of Wade's weaned calves at the local sale barn that fall, fed them out over the winter, and called Wade in February asking flat out who the sire was and whether there was any way to get breeding access for his own cows the following spring. Wade hadn't planned on leasing anything out. He'd never run a bull that anyone wanted access to before, and the idea of turning the animal into anything more than his own herd sire took some getting used to. He started leasing out breeding services that year anyway, a handful of straws collected and a short list of neighboring operations allowed to bring cows through for direct service, charging a fee that would have sounded absurd to him 2 years earlier for an animal that had arrived on his place as somebody else's mistake. By the following spring the list had grown past a dozen names, ranchers from as far as 60 miles out who'd heard about the calf crop secondhand and wanted in before Wade ran out of capacity. He kept the arrangement small and deliberate, the same way Otis Renfro had told him to run any breeding program worth trusting, never taking on more cows than the bull could reasonably cover in a season, and turning away offers from a couple of larger operations that wanted to buy the animal outright and move him off Wade's place entirely. Wade said no to every one of those offers without much deliberation. He hadn't spent 3 weeks proving what that bull actually was just to hand him off to somebody else's program the moment he became worth something. Kurt Whitfield came by that spring too, the same neighbor who'd leaned on the fence and told Wade to send the bull back. He didn't make a production of it. He just stood at the pen for a while, watched the bull move across the grass, and told Wade that he'd been wrong about the flag, and that he was glad Wade hadn't listened to him. Wade said he'd almost sent him back twice that first week. Kurt said that was the part that stuck with him, that Wade had almost done the smart thing, the thing anybody would have done, and instead spent 3 weeks finding out the truth instead of just accepting the easy version of it. Triangle Livestock never called again, not to ask about the bull, not to ask about the calves that were by then getting a small reputation of their own at the local sale barn. Wade didn't expect them to. He kept the original delivery sheet from that April morning in a drawer in the kitchen, the one with his ranch's name printed on it next to an ear tag number that belonged to an animal nobody at that company had bothered to look at twice. The bull is still standing in that same pasture outside Cross Timbers today, older now, heavier through the shoulder than he was that first morning, with a waiting list of ranchers still asking for breeding access every spring. Delbert Okafor still brings cows through every season, the same man who started the whole waiting list with one phone call in February of 2017, and he tells anyone who asks that the best cattle decision he ever made was noticing 3 unusually good calves at a sale barn and asking a question instead of letting it go. Otis Renfro still drives out most autumns to look over the new calf crop, slower on his feet now than he was that first afternoon at his kitchen table, but no less certain about what he's looking at. Wade tells people, when they ask how he ended up with the best stud on his ranch, that he didn't do anything special. He just refused to believe a piece of paper over an animal standing right in front of him. So here's the question worth sitting with. If a company handed you their worst news about something valuable, would you take their word for it, or would you go stand at the fence and look for yourself?